The Lord has an infinite brilliance in the way he works. He doesn't force us to obey him, but he still uses us to fulfill his purposes, whether we're submitted to him or not. Look at Babylon and Judah, right? Two kingdoms, two very different stories, and yet one God working through it all for his purpose. Babylon was a kingdom driven by greed and pride and a lust for power. Babylon was about conquering and ruling and exalting themselves. Judah, on the other hand, was called to be different, chosen by God with purpose, right, to make him known to the nations. They had experienced his miracles, his presence, his deliverance. So now, as he instructed them to follow his ways, right, to choose life, surely they, of all people, would eagerly and enthusiastically trust in his wisdom, in the goodness of his ways. And as they trust his word and obey his ways, the overflow of that would be that they'd be making him known to the nations. They'd be demonstrating to the world the beauty, the shalom, the blessing of what it means to walk in God's ways, which lead to life. But they didn't walk in his ways. Rather than shining out his ways into the darkness, they sought to emulate the darkness. They persisted in rejecting his calls to return to him, chasing after their own desires. So what does God do? As a discipline, as a corrective, he gives them what they want. He gives them over their cravings. You want what the nations have? Here you go, Babylon. The thing you think you want is painful and it's crushing and it's destructive. But you insist, so here you go. Babylon becomes what God calls his servant. Now, being his servant didn't mean the Lord endorsed Babylon's pride or cruelty. No, for this season, he simply allowed Babylon to serve, doing what Babylon was already intent on doing. He wasn't going to override their free will. Instead, he used their free will, their greed, their hunger, their power to serve his purposes. But even as he allowed them to rise, he was still calling out to Babylon. Now, look at how God multitasks. In his infinite wisdom, without overriding anyone's free will, the Lord would accomplish his purposes. On the one hand, the Babylonian exile would serve as a necessary discipline and a corrective for Judah. In exile, they would learn to seek God wholeheartedly. Jeremiah 29:13 says, "You will seek me and find me when you seek me with your whole heart." And at the same time, by allowing Judah to be taken into Babylon, the Lord was bringing those who were called to be his light into the very center of the kingdom of darkness. One way or another, his purposes would be accomplished. Judah would be a light to the nations. In Babylon, his people would be walking in their calling as a light to the nations, even as captives. Here you got Nebuchadnezzar, right? A king who thought he ruled the world. Yet in this very process of exile, God was calling out to him, making himself known to Nebuchadnezzar through dreams, through Daniel, through others. God was saying, look, Nebuchadnezzar, you have a choice. You can submit to me and find the beauty and the purpose, the life I have for you, or you can persist in exalting yourself in your rebellion and face judgment. And eventually Nebuchadnezzar, having been humbled, did submit to the Lord, but the nation, the leaders that followed, persisted in their rebellion, and eventually judgment came. It's like Samson. Remember, the Lord had a plan to accomplish through Samson's life, but Samson walked in his own ways, not the Lord's. And it ended up with him being blinded and shackled and crushed. God's plans were still accomplished. God's plans weren't thwarted by Samson's disobedience. The Lord accomplished what he wanted to do, but it didn't have to happen in such a crushing, painful, tragic way. Look, we're all going to accomplish God's purposes one way or the other. The question is, will we do it as willing, submitted servants, trusting his wisdom, finding joy and beauty in his plan, or will we rebelliously persist in clinging to our own understanding, ultimately maybe becoming vessels that serve as simply warnings about the consequences of walking in our own ways? Will you submit your will to the Lord? Will you pray, not what I want, Lord, but what you want? Not my will, but yours. Will you trust that his ways lead to life? Or will you keep clinging to your own desires, thinking you know better? God's calling out to you, to me, just like he called out to Judah, just like he called out to Nebuchadnezzar. He's giving us a chance to turn, to submit, to find the life he created us for. Right? Don't self-destruct. Choose life.